Benito Mussolini's ambition to conquer Ethiopia was deeply rooted in his vision for a new Roman Empire. This imperial dream took shape soon after his rise to power in 1922, marked by the dramatic March on Rome, which established his fascist authoritarian rule in Italy. Haunted by Italy's crushing defeat by Ethiopian forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, Mussolini set his sights on reclaiming Italy's honor in Africa. To lay the groundwork, he forged a secret agreement with Great Britain, establishing their spheres of influence within Ethiopia. However, this plan took an unexpected turn when the Ethiopian regent Ras Tafari uncovered the arrangement and presented it to the League of Nations. Undeterred, Mussolini soon devised a more complex approach. Instead of openly pursuing Ethiopia, he employed a two-pronged strategy: subversion and diplomacy. In Ethiopia's northern provinces, particularly in Tigray, Begemder, Gojam, and Wollo, Mussolini covertly supported local warlords and rebels who opposed the central imperial administration. Simultaneously, he extended diplomatic gestures to Ras Tafari, who would later become Emperor Haile Selassie in 1930. The two nations signed a treaty of friendship in 1928, and the Italian consulate was established in Ethiopia, creating an illusion of goodwill while allowing Italy to secure a foothold in the country. However, Selassie remained deeply suspicious of European powers, particularly Italy, and excluded all Italian representatives from his inner circle. In 1932, Italian colonial minister Emilio de Bono presented Mussolini with a formal plan to invade Ethiopia, aiming to seize the last remaining independent African kingdom. As a result, Italy's East African colonies of Eritrea and Somalia were quickly fortified as military staging grounds, while Italy itself ramped up munitions production. This militarization was complemented by an aggressive propaganda campaign across the Italian press, which painted Ethiopia as a disruptive force, accusing it of stirring unrest in Eritrea and hinting at fabricated border skirmishes to rally public support for the invasion. One key incident that precipitated the Italian invasion occurred at Walwal, an oasis in the Ogaden Desert near the border of Ethiopia and Italian Somaliland. Though it was known that Walwal lay within Ethiopian territory, the exact boundary line remained contested by Italy. In November 1934, Britain sent a frontier commission led by Lieutenant Colonel Esmond Clifford to survey the area and clarify the boundary between British Somaliland and Ethiopia. Clifford, aware of potential tensions, traveled with an escort of about 600 Ethiopian soldiers. Arriving at Walwal on November 23rd, they discovered a fortified Italian military presence of about 150 Italian and Somali troops led by Captain Roberto Shimaruda. Requesting Italian cooperation, Clifford asked Shimaruda for permission to camp nearby, but he was flatly denied. Seeking to avoid a diplomatic crisis, the English lieutenant withdrew his British contingent 20 miles northeast to Addo, leaving the Ethiopian escort at Walwal. For nearly 2 weeks, the Ethiopian and Italian troops faced off against one another. Reinforcements increased the Ethiopian contingent to about 1,500 men and the Italians to about 500, and on the 5th of December 1934, the first shots were fired. The Italians were supported by an armored car and bomber aircraft, resulting in about 110 Ethiopian casualties and 30 to 50 on the Italian and Somali side. In the aftermath of the skirmish, the Italian ambassador in Addis Ababa demanded compensation to the tune of £20,000 and an official statement recognizing Walwal as an Italian possession. In response, Emperor Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations, hoping for intervention. In doing so, he was counting on the support of Great Britain, whose representatives had, after all, been present in Walwal and personally witnessed the standoff. However, Ethiopia's appeals for assistance faced an uphill battle as the political landscape of Europe had changed fundamentally in the space of just a few short years. In 1933, the National Socialist Party came to power in Germany, and the new Reich, Adolf Hitler, made plain his ambition that Germany should become the dominant power in Europe. That October, Hitler withdrew Germany from the League of Nations, sending out a clear message that it no longer considered itself bound by any international agreements. At the time, Mussolini was at odds with Hitler, particularly over Germany's ambitions to annex Austria, which he considered part of Italy's sphere of influence. Seeing this, Britain and France were eager to sway Mussolini into an anti-German alliance, making them reluctant to support Ethiopia at Italy's expense. As a result, in January 1935, Rome and Paris signed an agreement that left Ethiopia isolated, clearing the way for Mussolini's next moves. With diplomatic resistance neutralized, Mussolini focused on mobilizing his forces. Hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers, along with tanks, artillery, and supplies, were deployed to Eritrea and Somalia, placing Ethiopia under imminent threat of invasion. In a final diplomatic blow, France and Britain imposed an arms embargo on both Italy and Ethiopia. While this action barely affected Mussolini, it had a devastating effect on Ethiopia.
I'm 15 years old. My home is in Addis Ababa. Italy wants to make war against my people. We are a peace-loving country and have much work to do here in Ethiopia without being troubled by foreign countries. We do not want war, but if we are attacked, we'll fight to the last drop of our blood to protect our homes. My father and brother will take me along when they go to war.
On the morning of October 3, 1935, Italy launched its long-anticipated invasion of Ethiopia. Leading the northern offensive from Eritrea was General Emilio de Bono, commanding about 100,000 Italian troops. General Rodolfo Graziani led the southern advance from Italian Somaliland. Mussolini had carefully orchestrated this two-pronged assault without any official declaration of war, as he hoped for a swift and decisive conquest. When news of the invasion reached Emperor Haile Selassie, he issued a call for nationwide mobilization, summoning all able-bodied men to defend their homeland. He assigned command of the northern forces to Ras Kassa, a trusted military leader, and placed Dejazmak Nasibu Zeyemanuel in charge of the southern army. The Ethiopian forces, though brave and determined, faced tremendous obstacles from the onset, especially in the border regions where Italians advanced with ease, encountering little organized resistance. Within days, de Bono's troops took control of Adwa, the site of great historical significance to the Ethiopians, and by mid-October, they reached Aksum, Ethiopia's ancient imperial capital. As they moved deeper into Ethiopian territory, the Italians were aided significantly by the defection of Dejazma Haile Selassie Gugsa, the emperor's son-in-law, who, along with his army of about 10,000 men, chose to fight on the Italian side. 2 days later, Haile Selassie ordered his main army under War Minister Ras Mulugeta Yegazu to march north from Addis Ababa, where it would join forces with Ras Kassa, Ras Seum, and Ras Imru. Together, they planned to launch a counteroffensive in Tigray. By early 1936, Italy had assembled one of the largest fighting forces Africa had ever seen, with 476,000 Italian troops and 87,000 African mercenaries fighting under colonial command. This massive force was aided by an astonishing array of war machinery: 500 tanks, 1,500 artillery pieces, 350 aircraft, and a staggering 15,000 machine guns. Over 500,000 rifles and muskets filled Italian supply lines, along with 100,000 horses, mules, donkeys, and 19,000 motorized vehicles. In stark contrast, the Ethiopian army numbered about 250,000 men, drawn largely from rural areas with limited modern training. They possessed only a handful of outdated tanks, and of the nation's 15 aircraft, only 8 were functional, and these were mostly unarmed transport planes. Ethiopia's elite 20,000-member Imperial Guard, while highly trained, could not single-handedly compensate for the country's equipment shortages and lack of mechanized support. Despite overwhelming odds, the Ethiopian forces fought the Italians with exceptional tenacity, shattering Italy's hopes for an easy victory. Frustrated by the unexpected resistance, Mussolini removed General de Bono after only 45 days, replacing him with the experienced Field Marshal Pietro Badoglio. Tasked with crushing the Ethiopian defense, Badoglio escalated the campaign's brutality to a whole new level. On November 28, 1935, Emperor Haile Selassie made a bold decision to travel to the front lines himself. Leaving his palace in Addis Ababa, he journeyed to Bisi, the capital of Wollo province, and set up his headquarters in the former Italian consulate. Fully aware of the stakes, the emperor followed the ancient Ethiopian custom of preparing his will before battle. Should he fall, he instructed his wife and children to seek refuge at the British embassy. Subsequently, Selassie launched a determined counteroffensive in December known as the Christmas Offensive. It was a coordinated assault involving 4 northern armies, commanded by Ras Seum, Ras Kassa, Ras Imru, and Ras Mulugeta. Together, they aimed to split the Italian forces, disrupt their lines, and slow their advance. Initially, the offensive succeeded, with Ethiopian forces reclaiming towns and delivering a decisive blow to the Italians at the Dambaguina Pass. However, this unexpected Ethiopian resistance forced the Italian command to escalate its tactics. Determined to crush Ethiopia's defenses, Field Marshal Pietro Badoglio unleashed a brutal and unprecedented weapon: poison gas. Despite Italy's commitment to the 1925 Geneva Protocol banning chemical weapons, Badoglio's forces rained mustard gas and arsenic-filled bombs down on Ethiopian troops and civilians alike. Over 1,000 tons of these deadly chemicals were dropped, causing devastating casualties across the country. In response, Selassie sent numerous pleas to the League of Nations, urging them to take action against Italy's use of chemical warfare, but his calls went unanswered. February 1936 signaled the beginning of Ethiopia's final, desperate struggle to fend off the Italian invasion. In a decisive blow, on February 19th, the Italian forces overwhelmed Ras Mulugeta's army at the Battle of Amba Aradan, killing him in the process. By the end of the month, the Ethiopian defenses continued to crumble. The armies of Ras Kassa and Ras Seum faced crushing losses at the Battle of Tembian, and days later, Ras Imru's troops were defeated at the Battle of Shire. These setbacks left Ethiopia's defenses on the brink of collapse, but Emperor Haile Selassie, refusing to surrender, made one last valiant attempt to turn the tide. Personally leading his imperial guard alongside the remnants of Ras Kassa's and Ras Seum's forces, he prepared for what he hoped would be a decisive engagement. On the morning of Tuesday, March 31, 1936, the Battle of Mechu commenced. The fight raged for nearly 18 hours, resulting in heavy losses on both sides. For Ethiopia, the outcome was devastating. Approximately 11,000 Ethiopian soldiers lost their lives in the battle, while the Italian and Eritrean losses were significantly lower. Consequently, on April 2nd, Selassie ordered a full retreat, but the withdrawal proved arduous. To make matters worse, the retreating Ethiopian troops soon came under attack from some of its compatriots. Warriors from the Oromo tribes of the Raya and Azebo, who had remained neutral throughout the conflict, now allied with the Italians. They attacked the retreating soldiers from the rear, resulting in more casualties than the battle itself. Blocked from their planned route to Addis Ababa through Wollo, the imperial troops were forced to take a punishing detour through Lasta and Lalibela. They arrived in Lalibela, where Haile Selassie secluded himself in a monastery, spending 3 days in quiet prayer with the monks. Meanwhile, the Italians advanced swiftly, capturing Bisi and the emperor's former headquarters. By April 14th, Italian forces under the command of General Rodolfo Graziani defeated the Southern Army under Dejazmach Nasibu, further tightening their grip on Ethiopian territory. As the emperor made his way back to the capital, rumors circulated in the international press that he had fled in disguise, riding a mule and shaving his beard to avoid detection. Despite these reports, Selassie reached Addis Ababa on the 30th of April. There, he gathered the privy and ministerial councils at the Menelik Palace to decide Ethiopia's next steps. With Italian forces closing in on the city, a heated debate ensued. Ras Kassa, seeing the impossibility of sustaining a guerrilla campaign, urged Selassie to leave Ethiopia and make a direct appeal to the League of Nations in Geneva. A vote was held, and the council overwhelmingly favored the emperor's departure. In the early hours of May 2, 1936, Haile Selassie and his family left Addis Ababa, boarding a train to begin their journey into exile. The emperor was accompanied by his wife, Empress Menen, and their 5 children. Among those joining them were Foreign Minister Haile Selassie and Ras Kassa. The emperor also brought along Ras Hailu, a political prisoner who had once attempted to rebel against him. Knowing Haile's history, Selassie feared he might defect to the Italians if left behind. Before departing, Selassie appointed Ras Imru as regent and tasked him with establishing a provisional government in Gore to lead the resistance. When the emperor's train paused briefly in Dire Dawa, he met with the British consul to arrange his passage to Europe. The emperor took this opportunity to release Ras Haile from his custody, who immediately returned to Addis Ababa and offered his allegiance to the Italians. On May 4th, Selassie and his family boarded the British Royal Navy cruiser HMS Enterprise in Djibouti and arrived in Haifa, Palestine. The following day, troops led by Field Marshal Pietro Badoglio entered the Ethiopian capital, officially marking the end of the war. 4 days later, on May 9th, Benito Mussolini appeared on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome and triumphantly announced to a cheering crowd the annexation of Ethiopia. By the end of the war, approximately 150,000 Ethiopians had lost their lives. Italy's victory allowed Mussolini to unite Ethiopia with the Italian colonies of Eritrea and Somalia, creating a new Italian East African empire known as Africa Orientale Italiana. The Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III, was proclaimed the new emperor of Ethiopia, and the commander of the Southern Army, General Rodolfo Graziani, was appointed viceroy. But true control over Ethiopia would continue to prove elusive for the Italians. A fierce resistance movement quickly rose, backed by Ethiopia's rural communities, making it nearly impossible for the occupiers to extend their power beyond the urban areas. As a result, in the coming years, the Italians would unleash a brutal campaign of repression and violence that led to the deaths of more than 400,000 Ethiopians, nearly 3 times the casualties suffered during the initial war. The most brutal event unfolded on February 19, 1937, after 2 Ethiopian resistance fighters attempted to assassinate General Graziani. On that day, the Italian viceroy was hosting a reception for Italian and Ethiopian dignitaries at the royal palace to mark the Prince of Naples' birthday. Then in a moment, 2 Ethiopian men threw bombs into the gathering, sending shockwaves all over the place. Graziani, who dived for cover, escaped with only minor wounds. Following this, the Italian viceroy launched a ruthless campaign of terror against the Ethiopian population, igniting a devastating massacre that swept through Addis Ababa. This horrific event would later be known as the Graziani Massacre. Italian soldiers poured into the streets, indiscriminately killing over 4,000 Ethiopians in the capital alone. Religious leaders were also targeted, with more than 1,500 monks, priests, and deacons executed in the bloodshed. In 1936, Emperor Haile Selassie arrived in Jerusalem and received news of Mussolini's annexation of Ethiopia. He then traveled to Britain, where he sought refuge with his family. The British government, under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and subsequently Neville Chamberlain, allowed him entry, swayed by public sympathy for Ethiopia's plight. However, Britain was cautious about taking any stance that could antagonize Italy. As a result, they imposed restrictions on the emperor's presence and tried to prevent him from appealing to the League of Nations. Undeterred, Selassie made his way to Geneva on June 30th. Standing before the League's General Assembly with remarkable resolve, he spoke passionately in his native Amharic and warned of the dangers of appeasing the aggressor. Though his speech was met with thunderous applause, the response from member states was painfully limited. By the end of the proceedings, most member states decided to lift the sanctions imposed on fascist Italy. Selassie's appeal to the world's conscience had fallen on deaf ears. Subsequently, the emperor and his family moved to Bath in England, where they struggled with limited finances, isolation, and ill health. In May 1940, a turning point came as Neville Chamberlain stepped down as prime minister and was replaced by Winston Churchill. Unlike his predecessor, Churchill viewed Nazi Germany as an existential threat and aligned closely with Selassie's opposition to fascism. Just weeks later, on June 10th, Italy officially entered World War II as an ally of Nazi Germany. With this alliance, Selassie's status shifted overnight from a forgotten exile to a symbol of resistance against fascism. Realizing the strategic importance of Selassie's influence, Britain no longer viewed him as a refugee, but as an important ally in the broader fight against the Axis powers. He left England for Sudan, where he would soon rally Ethiopian forces and spearhead the liberation of his homeland. On June 24, 1940, Haile Selassie embarked on a covert journey back to Africa. Traveling under the alias Mr. Smith to conceal his identity, he boarded a flying boat in Plymouth, accompanied by a small but loyal group. They traveled under the cover of night to Malta, where they transferred to another boat bound for Alexandria, Egypt. Finally arriving in Sudan, Selassie began to strategize, though his role in the fight for Ethiopia's liberation remained uncertain. Although Britain was organizing a joint Commonwealth force, which included troops from Kenya, Sudan, South Africa, India, and Australia, their actual preparations for an invasion of Italian East Africa were still vague. Meanwhile, the Italian forces had already taken British Somaliland in August 1940, tightening their grip on the region. Frustrated by the delays and lack of concrete action, Selassie issued an imperial proclamation declaring his intent to return to Ethiopia. He then appealed directly to Churchill, urging him to mobilize British forces without delay and arm Ethiopian refugees in British-controlled Somaliland and Kenya. Churchill, receptive to Selassie's appeal, sent Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden to Sudan to speed up the liberation effort. With Eden's arrival, the British command identified the man who would lead the Ethiopian campaign: Major Orde Wingate, a 37-year-old officer with a fierce drive and an unconventional approach to warfare. He formed a guerrilla unit specifically tasked with the liberation of Ethiopia, codenamed the Gideon Force. On November 28, 1940, Wingate flew to Gojum to meet with Brigadier Daniel Arthur Sanford, Selassie's longtime ally. Together, they devised a plan to unite Ethiopia's scattered resistance forces under Selassie's leadership. For Wingate and Sanford, the key was Selassie's symbolic presence on Ethiopian soil. They knew that his return would serve as a rallying cry and spark new waves of opposition to the Italian occupiers. Soon after Wingate arrived in Gojum, word of Selassie's presence in Sudan reached the Italians. In response, they appointed Ras Haile, a former rival of Selassie, as governor of Gojum to try to quell any resistance movement. While several tribal leaders initially sided with Ras Haile, their support proved insufficient to halt the growing momentum of the Allied campaign. In January 1941, the Allies launched a coordinated offensive across East Africa, striking the Italian forces from multiple fronts. A British Commonwealth army under General Sir Alan Cunningham advanced from Kenya into Italian Somaliland, while Major General Sir William Platt led divisions from Sudan into Eritrea, tightening the grip on Italian-controlled territories. Meanwhile, Wingate's Gideon Force, having left Khartoum in December, pushed through the mountainous terrain of Balaya toward Gojum, positioning themselves for decisive strikes against key Italian strongholds. Accompanying them was Emperor Haile Selassie. Rather than leading his forces on foot, the emperor strategically flew toward Ethiopia, escorted by 2 South African aircraft. With him was Ras Kassa, who had returned from Jerusalem with the heavy grief of losing 3 of his sons to the Italian occupation. Selassie's arrival was a rallying point for the Ethiopian patriots and tribal leaders who gathered to meet him in Balaya on February 6. By April 3rd, they reached the regional capital of Debre Marcos, a stronghold controlled by Ras Haile. Meanwhile, in the north, General Platt had broken through the Italian defenses at Keren, Eritrea, after a brutal 2-month battle. This victory allowed British forces to capture Asmara, the Eritrean capital, on April 1st. Sensing the shift in the war's momentum, Ras Haile surrendered to the British, liberating the entire region of Gojum from Italian control. Furthermore, General Cunningham's forces captured the city of Harar on the 27th of March and officially entered Addis Ababa on the 6th of April. But as the Ethiopian forces celebrated these victories, British leaders began to set plans of their own for a post-war Ethiopia. Anticipating the end of Italian control, the British established the Occupied Enemy Territory Administration to manage Ethiopia and the former Italian colonies of Eritrea and Somaliland. In a controversial move, They declared the Ethiopian province of Tigray to be part of Eritrea, overlooking Ethiopia's sovereignty. For Haile Selassie, these British maneuvers were deeply concerning. He had returned to Ethiopia to restore his nation's sovereignty, not to watch it reshaped by a new colonial force. Held under British orders in Debre Marcos for nearly 2 weeks, his patience wore thin. On April 22nd, General Cunningham issued a telegram to Major Wingate, explicitly instructing him to prevent Selassie's departure to Addis Ababa by all means short of force. However, Wingate, deeply committed to Ethiopian liberation and sympathetic to Selassie, defied Cunningham's orders and allowed the emperor to proceed. And so, with the support of Wingate and Sanford, Haile Selassie set off for Addis Ababa on April 27th, accompanied by his entourage, including Ras Kassa and the recently surrendered Ras Hailu. On May 5th, exactly 5 years after the city fell to the Italians, Emperor Haile Selassie returned to Addis Ababa in a grand parade. At the Menelik Palace, he raised the Ethiopian flag, and the roar of a 21-gun salute echoed through the city, signaling Ethiopia's return to self-rule.
It is good that you are here to record this picture of me in my palace garden at Addis Ababa. People who see this throughout the world will realize that even in the 20th century, with faith, courage, and a just cause, David will still beat Goliath.
Back in London, there was much debate over how Ethiopia would be governed after its liberation. British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden publicly affirmed Ethiopia's independence, but argued for a period of military guidance and control to support the nation's recovery. However, this control soon extended far beyond what was initially promised. The British took charge of almost every aspect of Ethiopian governance, from communication systems like radio, telegraph, and telephone services to the regulation of all imports and exports. The Ethiopian economy was tightly integrated into Britain's colonial territories, and the East African shilling replaced the Ethiopian currency. Additionally, Britain established a monopoly on commercial air transport. In return for these controls, Haile Selassie received significant financial aid from Britain. But despite this, the emperor became increasingly concerned about the erosion of Ethiopian sovereignty. Although he relied on British resources to stabilize the country, Selassie began secretly planning to regain full control. His growing frustration led him to consider expelling the British military mission altogether. However, British intelligence soon learned of his plans. Rather than face public expulsion, the British preemptively offered to withdraw their mission, claiming that Ethiopia had become self-sufficient enough to maintain its own military. With the British military gone, Selassie turned to the United States, seeking support to modernize and strengthen Ethiopia's armed forces. The US, already wary of British influence in the region, welcomed the opportunity. With American support, Selassie was able to establish a strong bureaucracy, staffed largely by officials who had remained loyal to him during his years in exile. During Ethiopia's prolonged struggle against the Italian occupation, a powerful new political force emerged. They were called the Patriots. These fighters, many of whom had risked their lives while the emperor was in exile, were deeply angered by Haile Selassie's decision to leave them behind during their battle for independence. When the emperor returned and began making alliances with those who had collaborated with the Italians, they grew distrustful and resentful. They felt their sacrifices had been overlooked and that they had been unjustly excluded from the new government. The most notable among these leaders was Haile Selassie, a charismatic and well-respected freedom fighter. Haile had hoped his years of sacrifice would earn him a prominent role in the new government, but instead he was given a seemingly insignificant post as governor of the Bichena district in Gojam. Feeling snubbed and undervalued, Haile led an uprising against the emperor in February 1943. The emperor responded by sending an army to suppress the rebellion. Haile and his supporters retreated to the mountains, holding their ground for 3 months before they were ultimately defeated. Captured and brought to Addis Ababa, Haile was sentenced to life imprisonment. But despite his imprisonment, the zealous patriot continued to resist. He allied with a fellow inmate, Mamo Haile Mikhail, and together they escaped from prison, killing their guards in the process. However, they were soon recaptured in northern Ethiopia. This time, Haile Selassie made an example of them. On January 12, 1945, Bele, his brother, Mamo, and several other rebels were publicly executed in Addis Ababa. For many patriots and their supporters, Bele's death only cemented his legacy as a martyr. His memory, along with his rebellion, became a powerful symbol for future opposition movements against the emperor's rule. During Selassie's early years as regent, he faced constant challenges in consolidating his power, which left him wary of potential threats to his authority. His experiences led him to establish an elaborate security apparatus to protect his rule, with the imperial bodyguard becoming its cornerstone. This elite unit of the Ethiopian army, entrusted with safeguarding the emperor, was led by Brigadier Mulugeta Buli, a veteran of the Italian resistance who had returned to the country with the Gideon force. Under his command, the imperial bodyguard grew in strength and sophistication, securing both the emperor's safety and the stability of his regime. However, a turning point came in 1955 when Mulugeta Buli was replaced as head of the imperial bodyguard by Brigadier Mengistu Niwe, a young, idealistic officer driven by reformist ambitions. Mengistu was an emerging voice within the ranks, outspoken and increasingly frustrated by Selassie's authoritarian policies. While he initially carried out his duties, Mengistu's discontent grew as he watched the emperor's firm grip on power and his refusal to implement progressive reforms. By the late 1950s, his discontent with Selassie's regime had transformed into a quiet, festering rebellion. Secretly, he began laying the groundwork for a bold plot to challenge the emperor. Consequently, in 1960, Brigadier Mengistu Niwe would be at the center of a bloody coup that would shake the foundations of the empire to its core.